So another really interesting survey. It was purchased quite recently. There was a damp and timber report at the time of the purchase, and amazingly, they came up with a £16,000 cost, 16,104. But the interesting thing is, so they've got lots of damp proofing and they say there should be some wet rot and so on, but they also say it's optional. Interesting one. Why would you do it if it was not necessary? Anyway, it's part of the PCA. Now, I'm also qualified with the PCA, but they won't let me be a member, maybe because I show up the issues with their contractors. Now, here's the rear wall, and I'm also using a protimeter radio frequency damp meter, and actually the wall is largely dry. Anything below about 300 is dry, and this was the dampest part of the property originally. It was part of the property that was damp proofed. Interestingly enough, the paint, the surface paint there is an oil-based paint, and what's happened is the water has got in behind, and calcium sulfate salts are crystallizing behind the oil-based paint. And I'll show you the reasons why, but this part of the property was actually damp proofed. So, you know, if it worked, why was it damp? Good question. Anyway, we'll have a look at the outside in a moment, but the whole way along this wall was deemed to be damp by that damp proofing contractor, and now it's dry. So I am told that the previous owners didn't heat the property and didn't ventilate the property. So that's one important thing. I also am told that the gutter was replaced, and when we look on the outside, you'll see the telltale signs of penetrating damp as seen from the outside, but you should always check during a rainstorm to see what's actually happening. So they're the crystallized salts and lots of cracking. The easiest thing to do is just remove it. I imagine it was probably an oil-based stain block primer like Zinza cover stain, which is inappropriate for this sort of location. Great for hiding hygroscopic salts, not good for hiding condensation and penetrating damp. Now, looking through a thermal imaging camera, you can see there's lots of heat loss there, and the importance of that is that where there's heat loss, you're going to have an increased risk of condensation. So this ties up with the subfloor vent on the outside. Now, subfloor vents are important belt and braces against, or backstop if you like, using an American term, against water going into the subfloor void. And we're going to look at that in a sec. A damp-proof course is also a backstop, a belt and braces, in case you have water going into the damp-proof course, into the subfloor, and any source of water can rise, but rising damp is strictly groundwater. That's the water under the water table. Have a look at the zone. You can see there's no risk. Now, looking at the outside, there's a subfloor void air brick there, which is good, but it's a little bit low, and what can happen is that rainwater can fall on the patio and can go into the subfloor voids. So you should really be measuring the subfloor relative humidity, because you have got a risk of, one, condensation forming above the damp-proof course. If you look at a previous survey, you can see what can happen with that, but you can have rising damp-like symptoms. You can also have a risk of rot in the subfloor void. But I measured the relative humidity at the time of the survey, and it was normal. And if you compare it to another property where it did have a problem, that was much higher. Looking at the wall, we can see that there's green, that's ongoing moss. Now, looking at the neighbour's gutter, we can see it's full of vegetation, suggesting overflow from the neighbour's gutter. So they have a loft conversion, so it'd be quite easy for them to just scoop out the vegetation and stop that. You can see the moss here has pretty much died back, so that's suggesting to me that your work on fixing your gutters has worked. But what you should do is check during a rainstorm, have a look to see where the water's flowing. Everyone has a risk of gutters overflowing. And what happens is the water goes into the brick, and then some of it will penetrate through just because of the concentration of water. And you probably have a brown stain on the inside, and the previous owners probably painted it with an oil base stain block so that it didn't show at the time that they were selling the property. But obviously what happens is the water is dissolving the calcium sulfate salts, which is an ingredient in plaster and cement, and it crystallizes underneath the paintwork, so leaves that. So the drains look okay, always good to check them. And in London, there is always a risk, or old drains, the property is 100 and something years old, so there's always a risk of drain failure. And think about CCTV camera. Some of that £16,104 that I saved you could go to checking your drains out. I don't know. I've done it myself and discovered a collapsed drain below the property. So worth thinking about. But I didn't see telltale signs, and I didn't see rot in the subfloor void. I'm just checking for the drip groove underneath the windowsill, and it's fine. But this wall has been damp proofed, and by and large that reduces its insulating capacity, so therefore increases the risk of mold and condensation. This one also had penetrating damp from the outside, so that's another consideration. Notice it's been repointed at some stage. Very, very rare is that ever needed, but hey ho, not necessarily a bad thing. So the biggest cost, and I think the thing you were most concerned about, was the timber flooring at the back of the property. It was old flooring. There were signs of old woodworm. It's very rare that woodworm is current, and anyway, it's very easy to treat it with just a bit of permethrin you can buy for pounds, not hundreds of pounds. But the thing is that you do have to treat it over successive years. But you know, from my point of view, another way of doing it is just take photos before and after, and just see what happens. Oh yeah, there was some woodworm in the timber underneath the stairs. Again, just some permethrin, a few squirts of it, and you know, ideally you paint it, or you put resin or something to then, or take photos of it so that you can see if the holes have reappeared, because it does have a 2 to 3 years life cycle, but it's highly unlikely to be ongoing. And anyway, even if it were ongoing, the damage is minimal. One could say that it's part of the character of an old property. The trouble is, when you come to sell it, you know, you have to say what you've done, and if you can prove that there's no change over the course of a few years, then you can prove that there's no woodworm and no need for treatment or cost reduction. So now we're looking underneath the subfloor void, and this is the area that was supposedly had rot. You know, historically there may well have been some rot, but there was no sign of ongoing rot. It looked perfectly dry. You can see there's a bit of frass caught in the spider's web, but it doesn't look ongoing. But you know, you could squirt it with a little bit of permethrin. Buy it very inexpensively. Amazon or any other retailers supply it. So there was some concern about dampness along the hearth, so I put a data logger. I put a hygrometer probe into the subfloor void. It was pre-calibrated. I left it with you. It showed the relative humidity was about 70%, which is normal relative humidity, suggesting there isn't a problem, but there is a risk of water entering the subfloor through the air brick, just because the rainwater could do. So as I say, I left it with you, 70%, no big pereiras, as they say. So you tell me that when you're away and you come back, you sometimes smell mold. Well, there were some signs of mold, but one thing you should be aware of is that there's the cold water pipe there, and the cold water comes into the property about 8 degrees centigrade in winter. So you do have a risk of mold in that zone, and I've found some elsewhere. Very simple thing to do is put insulation around it. And anyway, I think you want to do that because at the moment you've got the hot water from the heating system next to the cold water, and it's not ideal. You're wasting energy. This is looking through the thermal imaging camera at the cold water pipe, and it had dripped actually. There's a very small drip in it, and that's why you've got that little blue thing. I recommend using a hygrometer to check for dew point or a data logger. Have a listen to the survey. I've left some of it in for you. So vapor can be measured in grams per cubic meter, but it can also be measured in terms of temperature as the dew point. Dew point's also the temperature where condensation takes place at. And you got a dew point of 5.9, and what you should be doing is trying to keep the internal dew point below the outside temperature at all times, and that will eliminate condensation and mold issues.
Okay.
What happens in some properties is
smaller one, but
has 20 litres a day, because that's the speed that clothes dry at. I mean, that doesn't look pretty, but I don't think it looks damp either.
So this has been removed. When they put the windows, they stripped the wallpaper back.
Oh, it looks okay there. Do you see there's this very small hint of mould there?
Oh, okay.
And what can happen is that when radiators aren't in use, so in autumn and spring, when it can get really cold outside, but warm during the day, and what happens is that you get cold in the radiators at night, and it creates a zone of cold around here, and if you've got high humidity, you don't have trickle vents.
Oh, we do. They're just concealed.
Ah, okay. I
We
mean,
haven't opened them really this winter.
they're not. It's not a big deal. It's a sort of it's a requirement now, but it's not. They don't make a huge difference. It's better to manage indoor vapor with data loggers. We should have a look at that actually. This is a brown stain from water passing through building material, and it is damp there, but it's dry there. And we'll have a look on the other side, but we think it comes from the bathroom. So these, so you got cracks in the ground. I mean,
And
inevitable.
This is awful.
Do you use a shower facility feature?
All the time. Yeah.
I mean, it's not going to damage the wall permanently. It's just the explanation for why you've got dampness in the wall there.
Yeah.
But it's not like it's going to. I mean, dampness actually, funnily enough, doesn't really damage walls. It will damage the painting. It's what the dampness does that's not great, and it allows A, mold to grow, and B, rot and woodworm. So it's not actually, and also reduces the insulating capacity of a wall. So this one. So I like to test for mains water when there's a concern about vapour in the subfloor void. With your case, I couldn't turn your mains water stopcock off outside, and you really need to be able to isolate it outside, and there was a drip on the internal stopcock. Anyway, during the period of about an hour, I took a photo before and after, and there was no change on the meter suggesting that there is no leak, but this isn't especially sensitive. I think it's probably to the 10th of a litre or something. But what you can do is check it before and after going away for a weekend or a long holiday, or a holiday, should I say, and just see if there's any change with no water. Anyway, have a listen to the data loggers now. The data loggers, at the time of the survey, your wall was 11.2. So if we compare the kitchen to the living room, 11.2 at on the 14th at 3:33. I suppose that's it was about 2 beginning of the survey. So it shows me relatively normal levels. There doesn't seem to be any difference between the data loggers. I'll have a look into the reason why that is. This dew point is on the high side. You want to increase the ventilation, in particular the kitchen and drying clothes. I know you had a condenser or condenser dryer, yes. They tend to throw out quite a lot of vapor. The bathroom door needs to be kept closed with the vent on, but so you want to reduce the amount of vapor. But basically the wall itself was not suffering from condensation. You had some historic penetration damp. You had it damp proofed, which obviously reduces its thermal insulation. Well, not obviously, but the purpose of the damp proofing takes out the pores within a wall. So, and it's the air holes that actually insulate. So by doing so, you're reducing the insulation benefit of the plaster. So it increases the risk of condensation and mold. But I would say your owners would have been suffering from condensation, and they painted an oil-based paint which stops the wall from breathing. Personally, I would remove that, and you might think about some insulation there as well. But do keep an eye on the penetrating damp on the outside.